All right, so listeners, get this. You know that feeling when you're just dragging, you can't seem to shake the brain fog, and your jeans are fitting a little snugger than usual?
Ugh, tell me about it.
Well, turns out for a lot of people, the culprit might be lurking in a tiny butterfly-shaped gland in your neck.
The thyroid.
Exactly, the thyroid. You asked for a deep dive into how hypothyroidism is diagnosed and who should get screened. So we've got some seriously interesting medical research to unpack.
Yeah, and you know what's fascinating to me is that this isn't some rare, obscure condition we're talking about.
Right.
The stats on how common thyroid issues are, they kind of blew my mind.
Okay, so let's talk numbers. Before we get lost in the details,
Mm-hmm.
what exactly is hypothyroidism?
Well, think of your thyroid as this tiny hormone factory, right?
Okay.
It pumps out T4 and T3, and these hormones are basically your body's gas pedal, controlling your metabolism, your energy levels, and a ton of other stuff.
Yeah.
Hypothyroidism means that factories going on strike, not producing enough of those crucial hormones.
Okay. And we got another player in this story, right? TSH,
Oh, yeah.
thyroid stimulating hormone. How does that fit in?
So TSH is like the manager trying to get that factory back on track. It's sent from your pituitary gland up in your brain, and it's supposed to tell the thyroid, hey, step it up, we need more hormones.
Okay.
But in hypothyroidism, the message isn't getting through, or the thyroid just can't keep up.
So picture like a manager frantically yelling at a bunch of sleepy workers, and that's TSH trying to motivate a sluggish thyroid.
Yeah, perfect analogy.
But seriously, how often does this actually happen? Our sources mentioned some pretty shocking stats from a massive U.S. study.
Get this. The NADNESIS study, it found that almost 1 in 20 people in the U.S. are dealing with some form of hypothyroidism.
Wow.
That means if you're listening to this, there's a decent chance you know someone who's dealing with this, maybe even without realizing it.
I had no idea it was that common.
Yeah.
So we've got this, like, silent epidemic on our hands. And part of the problem is that the symptoms are super tricky, right? It's not always as obvious as someone suddenly needing a bigger belt size.
Oh, exactly. One of the sources described it like trying to solve a mystery with only half the clues. You might be tired all the time, gain weight, have trouble concentrating, but all those things could be caused by a million other things too, like stress, lack of sleep, or just life in general.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I check off at least 3 of those symptoms on any given Monday morning.
Right.
So relying on symptoms alone is a recipe for missing hypothyroidism completely.
Pretty much. That's why lab tests are the MVPs in this situation. They give us the concrete evidence we need to see what's really going on with your thyroid hormones.
Okay, lab tests. Got it. So walk us through how doctors actually diagnose hypothyroidism. Our sources mentioned 2 main types,
Yeah.
primary and central. What's the difference?
Let's start with primary hypothyroidism because that's the most common type by far. We're talking over 95% of cases. Remember our manager analogy.
Yeah.
In primary hypothyroidism, the factory itself is the problem.
So the workers are just slacking off no matter how loud the manager yells.
Exactly. And that's where the TSH test comes in. If your TSH level is high, it means your pituitary gland is sending out a ton of TSH, desperately trying to get that thyroid working.
So high TSH, sluggish thyroid, makes sense. But what about those free T4 levels we hear about?
Right.
How do they factor into the diagnosis?
So think of free T4 as a measure of the actual output from the factory. So doctors look at both numbers. A high TSH along with a low free T4 level confirms that, yes, this is definitely overt hypothyroidism.
Okay. High TSH, low output. That's a clear sign something's wrong. Our source even had a handy chart breaking all this down. But what about situations where TSH is high, but free T4 looks normal?
That's what we call subclinical hypothyroidism, and it's where things get a little more nuanced. It's like the factory is starting to slow down, but it hasn't totally shut down yet.
Gotcha.
We'll dive into the details of subclinical hypothyroidism a bit later, but for now, just remember that it's not as straightforward as the overt cases.
Got it. So we've got primary hypothyroidism, the common culprit. What about that other type? Central hypothyroidism. Our sources described it as the rarer of the two.
Right. Central hypothyroidism is like having a problem with the manager themselves. In this case, the issue lies higher up in the chain of command, either in the pituitary gland that sends out TSH or in the hypothalamus, which is like the big boss controlling the pituitary.
So it's not the thyroid factory itself that's the problem. It's a breakdown in communication from the top.
Exactly. This is where things get interesting for you, because if you happen to have other hormonal issues, or maybe a history of pituitary problems, central hypothyroidism might be something to keep on your radar.
Interesting. But there's a twist, right? Our sources said TSH levels in central hypothyroidism can be all over the place. Low, normal, or even high. How does that make sense?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You'd think if the manager's out of commission, TSH would always be low, but sometimes the pituitary might be sending out faulty TSH. The signal is there, but it's gibberish, so the thyroid doesn't know what to do.
Hmm.
Other times, there might be damage to the pituitary itself, causing it to underproduce TSH. The key here is to look at the free T4 levels.
Okay.
If those are low, it points to central hypothyroidism, regardless of what the TSH is doing.
Okay, so we can't rely on TSH alone in those cases. We need the full picture, TSH and free T4, to crack the code. But before we get too deep into those rarer cases, I have to ask, are there other things that can mimic hypothyroidism even if your thyroid is actually fine?
You bet. There's this whole category of conditions called differential diagnoses, and they can be real curveballs when it comes to interpreting those TSH results. For example, you know how you sometimes feel completely wiped out after being sick?
Oh, tell me about it. I'm basically a human slug for a week after a cold.
Well, it turns out even your thyroid can get thrown off by a bug. Recovering from an illness, surgery, or even extreme stress can cause your TSH to spike temporarily, even if your thyroid is perfectly healthy.
So if you see a high TSH after being under the weather, don't panic.
Exactly.
It might not be a thyroid issue at all.
It usually takes a few weeks for things to settle down.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some truly rare scenarios where the thyroid itself is the problem, but not in the way you'd expect. Have you ever heard of resistance to TSH?
I think so, but it sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. Explain it to me like I'm 5.
Okay, imagine the thyroid has put up a giant do not disturb sign,
Okay.
and it's ignoring all the frantic messages from TSH. That's resistance to TSH. The thyroid just stops responding to those signals, even if the pituitary is sending out plenty of it.
So it's like the manager is shouting instructions, but the factory workers are wearing noise-canceling headphones and blissfully ignoring them.
That's the perfect analogy. And this can happen because of genetic mutations, problems with the way the TSH receptor works, or even certain medications. The result: a high TSH that looks like hypothyroidism, but the free T4 might be normal, or even a bit low depending on how severe the resistance is.
Wow, that's crazy. So if you're dealing with a high TSH, it's crucial to have a doctor who can play detective and figure out what's really going on.
Absolutely. A thorough medical history, a good old-fashioned physical exam, and those all-important lab tests are essential for putting all the pieces together. Speaking of connecting the dots, let's talk about the most frequent offender when it comes to primary hypothyroidism: Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Ah, yes. That's the autoimmune condition we mentioned earlier, right?
You got it. In Hashimoto's, your immune system gets a little confused and starts attacking your thyroid gland like it's some kind of foreign invader. This leads to inflammation, and eventually the thyroid just can't keep up with hormone production.
And those thyroid peroxidase antibodies we mentioned earlier, they're like the fingerprints at the scene of the crime, right? A sign that Hashimoto's is the culprit.
Right on. For most cases of overt hypothyroidism, doctors don't routinely test for these antibodies, mainly because Hashimoto's is so common.
Yep.
But if you have a goiter or your symptoms are particularly bothersome, testing for those antibodies can help confirm the diagnosis.
Okay, so we've covered what hypothyroidism is, how it's diagnosed, and even touched on those tricky cases that can throw a wrench into the works.
Yeah.
But the big question for a lot of people is, who needs to be screened for this in the first place?
That's where the guidelines get a bit murky.
Okay.
There's no blanket recommendation to routinely screen everyone for hypothyroidism. It's a bit of a balancing act.
Because as we mentioned, hypothyroidism can be sneaky, and overtreating it can cause its own set of problems, right?
Exactly. But there are definitely certain red flags that should prompt a conversation with your doctor about getting checked.
And our source had a handy checklist for those risk factors.
Right. They did. Things like a family history of thyroid problems, any personal history of autoimmune diseases, having radiation therapy to the head or neck, or even certain medications that can mess with your thyroid.
So if any of those ring a bell for you.
Definitely bring it up with your doctor. It's always better to be safe than sorry. And speaking of being safe, there's one group where screening gets particularly tricky: pregnant women.
Oh, right. Our source mentioned there's a big debate about whether to screen all pregnant women for hypothyroidism.
Exactly. Some experts are all for universal screening, while others prefer a more targeted approach, focusing on women who have specific risk factors.
So like a personalized risk assessment.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But let's wrap up this part of our deep dive by circling back to those screening tests. We know TSH is the star player, but is it always enough?
For most people, especially those being screened for primary hypothyroidism, the TSH test is super reliable and usually does the trick. However,
There are always exceptions, aren't there?
you know it. Remember those tricky cases we talked about? If there's any reason to suspect central hypothyroidism, or maybe someone's taking a medication that messes with TSH levels, then measuring free T4 is a must-have. Luckily, our source had another super helpful table outlining all those specific situations.
So the bottom line is, TSH is a great starting point, but sometimes we need that free T4 data to complete the puzzle.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And never forget, lab tests are just one piece of the puzzle. A good conversation with your doctor is key for interpreting those results and figuring out the best next steps for you.
Great point. All right, I think we've built a solid foundation here. We've explored what hypothyroidism is, how it's diagnosed, and even tackled those tricky cases that can make things confusing. But our deep dive isn't over yet. In part 2, we'll unpack the nuances of subclinical hypothyroidism and dive deeper into those fascinating, albeit rare, differential diagnoses. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So far, we've uncovered just how sneaky hypothyroidism can be and why those lab tests are so essential for getting a clear diagnosis. But before we move on, I've got a confession. The whole subclinical hypothyroidism thing is still a bit fuzzy for me.
It's a tricky area for sure. It's like that in-between zone where things aren't quite black and white. Remember, in subclinical hypothyroidism, the TSH is elevated, signaling that your pituitary gland is trying to nudge that thyroid into action. But the free T4 levels are still normal.
Right, so it's like the thyroid's running a little slow, but it hasn't totally stalled out yet. But the big question is, do you actually need treatment for that? Our sources seem to indicate that it's not always a clear-cut decision.
You hit the nail on the head. There's no magic formula here. Doctors have to consider a bunch of factors, like how high the TSH actually is, whether you're having any symptoms, your age, even your overall health picture.
So a slightly elevated TSH might not be a big deal, especially if you're feeling fine otherwise.
Exactly. But if that TSH is significantly elevated, even with normal free T4, it might be a sign that things are headed in the wrong direction. And treatment might be a good idea to prevent it from progressing to, full-blown hypothyroidism.
Makes sense. It's all about weighing the potential benefits against the risks. And speaking of risks, let's circle back to those differential diagnoses, those sneaky conditions that can mimic hypothyroidism.
Ah, yes, the imposters. They can really make things tricky. Remember we talked about how getting sick can temporarily throw your thyroid out of whack?
Oh yeah, the whole human slug phenomenon after a cold.
Well, our source had a fancy term for it. Recovery from non-thyroidal illness. Basically, any major stress on your body, an infection, surgery, even extreme emotional stress, can mess with your thyroid hormones for a bit.
So if you happen to have a high TSH after a nasty bout of the flu, it doesn't automatically mean you've got hypothyroidism.
Not necessarily. It's kind of like your body hitting the reset button after a major event. Most of the time, things go back to normal on their own. But it's a good idea to recheck those TSH and free T4 levels a few weeks later, just to be sure.
Okay, so don't jump to conclusions. Patience is key. But what about those super rare situations where the thyroid itself is being stubborn? Like that resistance to TSH thing we touched on earlier.
Right, the thyroid's version of selective hearing. Remember, in TSH resistance, the thyroid basically becomes deaf to the signals from the pituitary gland, even if there's plenty of TSH floating around.
And then the sources mentioned that this could be caused by genetic mutations or even certain medications, right?
Exactly. It's like the communication lines are down between the pituitary and the thyroid, and the messages just aren't getting through. This can make diagnosis tricky because you might see a high TSH, but the free T4 levels could be normal or even low.
So how on earth do doctors figure out if it's true hypothyroidism or this TSH resistance thing?
It takes some serious detective work. They'll look at your family history, see if there's any pattern of thyroid issues, give you a good physical exam to check for things like a goiter, and might even order specialized tests to see how that TSH receptor is functioning.
Sounds like you need a specialist who's really in the know to untangle those cases.
Yeah.
What other imposters should we be on the lookout for?
Well, there's one more rare but fascinating condition that our source mentioned. TSH-secreting pituitary adenomas.
Okay, break that down for me. What's an adenoma again?
An adenoma is basically a benign tumor, kind of like a little lump. And in this case, it's a tumor in the pituitary gland, the manager in our factory analogy, that's churning out TSH like there's no tomorrow.
But here's where my brain melts a little. Our source said this TSH overload can actually lead to hyperthyroidism, the opposite of what we've been talking about this whole time.
I know it sounds crazy, right? But here's the thing, the TSH that this tumor is producing is actually the real deal, biologically active stuff.
Oh.
So instead of telling the thyroid to slow down, it's sending the message to ramp up production, leading to an excess of thyroid hormones.
So you could have a high TSH but high free T4 as well. Talk about a plot twist.
Exactly. And these cases really highlight why we can't rely on TSH alone. We need both TSH and free T4 to get the full story. It's like needing both the video and audio feed to understand what's really happening.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. So the bottom line is, when it comes to thyroid disorders, things aren't always as straightforward as they seem. There's a whole lot of nuance and complexity going on behind the scenes.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, if you're ever unsure about your thyroid health, don't hesitate to talk to your doctor. They're the experts at deciphering these mysteries.
Absolutely. All right, we've covered a ton of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored the gray areas of subclinical hypothyroidism and uncovered those fascinating, albeit rare, conditions that can mimic it.
But our deep dive isn't over yet. We'll be back to wrap things up with some final thoughts and a thought-provoking question to leave you pondering in part 3.
All right, we're back for the final part of our hypothyroidism deep dive.
Yeah.
I feel like we've gone like full-on detective mode here, trying to unravel all the mysteries of the thyroid.
It's been quite the journey. But, before we close the case for good, it's always good to recap, right? Just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Okay, yeah, good idea. So, big picture, just how common is hypothyroidism, really? Give us the headline stat.
Well, remember that mind-blowing number we talked about, the NASE third study? They found that a whopping 4.6% of the U.S. population is dealing with some form of hypothyroidism. That's almost 1 in 20 people. So chances are, if you're listening, you probably know somebody who's affected, maybe even without realizing it.
It's crazy to think it's that widespread. And as we've learned, the symptoms can be so subtle, it's easy to just brush them off as like stress or just getting older.
Exactly. That's why those lab tests, the TSH and free T4, are so crucial. They're like shining a spotlight on what's really going on with your thyroid hormones.
Right. Because, I mean, feeling tired or gaining a few pounds, that could mean a million different things, right?
Yeah.
But those lab results, those give us the hard evidence.
Absolutely. And if you're listening to this, you're thinking, maybe I should get checked. Just remember those risk factors we talked about: family history of thyroid issues, any autoimmune diseases, certain medications. Those are all red flags that are definitely worth a conversation with your doctor.
Yeah, early detection's key. Because the good news is, if you do have hypothyroidism, the treatment is usually pretty straightforward and effective.
That's right. And speaking of treatment, we're actually going to be doing a deep dive into that topic on a future episode.
Ooh, exciting.
But for now, I want to leave you with something to ponder, something that really got me thinking. Our source mentioned that TSH levels can actually be naturally higher in older adults, even if their thyroid is functioning totally fine.
Wait, really? That's interesting. But, I mean, it also makes you wonder, couldn't that make diagnosing hypothyroidism in older folks even more complicated?
It's a really important question. Does that higher TSH always signal a true deficiency? Or is it just, a normal part of aging? It's definitely something researchers are still trying to figure out.
That's definitely something to think about. It seems like the thyroid is full of surprises.
It definitely keeps us on our toes. But hey, if you've made it through this whole deep dive with us, you are now armed with some serious knowledge about how hypothyroidism is diagnosed and who should be screened.
You're practically an expert now. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your health. So don't be afraid to ask questions, advocate for yourself, and of course, if you have any concerns at all, talk to your doctor.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a blast exploring the world of the thyroid.
Until next time, stay curious and keep those brains firing.